Hi, I'm Sergio Caltagirone, Vice President of Threat Intelligence at Dragos. A long history in tracking and hunting for advanced and sophisticated adversaries, much like what is happening with SolarWinds. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ben really quick.
Hey, thanks, Serge. Hi, everyone. Ben Miller. I lead the services and R&D teams at Dragos, and we'll be bringing in some of the conversations that we've been having with our customers into this discussion as well. But I'll kick it over to Kai.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, I'm Kai. I lead the incident response team and hunting team here at Dragos, so work for Ben. Been working with SolarWinds over the past few days quite a bit, so trying to get you guys some insight into what we've been tracking and how we're doing that.
Awesome. I'll kick it over to you, Serge.
Awesome. So we're going to break this conversation down into really three parts for you, which is kind of what we know, what we don't know. So kind of our current knowledge. And then we're going to talk a little bit about our recommendations around these environments and what a SolarWinds installation looks like inside of an industrial control environment, and also our best, our guidance, our recommendations for how you manage that from a cybersecurity perspective. And lastly, and probably important to a majority of our audience is, okay, well, how do I then figure out if I'm affected and how much I'm affected in this campaign, in this incident? And then we're going to finish off with some Q&A at the end. Unless somebody drops in some very simple questions in the Q&A during the session, happy to address those while we're speaking as well. So next slide. So the big thing we have to understand is that SolarWinds is a very big product used by hundreds of thousands of organizations worldwide. And that we know that there was a compromise of the SolarWinds Orion product, and that included compromises of industrial control system environments, which includes critical infrastructure sectors. And the real basics of it are that at this moment, the majority of those who are affected don't have the necessary visibility to conduct a post-compromise or post-incident review and assessment as to, okay, well, are we compromised? Are we not compromised? And if we are, how bad is it? And what do we do now? And so our hope during this presentation is to lay out a bit of the facts of what's going on and what we know, and also recognizing very much that this is an ongoing investigation and situation. And so we're only about a week into it so far. And we're going to be learning a lot more, obviously, as the future continues to, unravel this onion. And, so some of this advice, most of this advice is going to be completely valid, regardless of what's going to happen in the threat environment. And really, we're going to focus on best practices, which is, okay, what do you do now, regardless of kind of what is going to happen in the future? So our hope is to give you some really good insight into regardless of what changes, what you should be doing about it. Next. So SolarWinds is a company that I think was a surprise to many people in the cybersecurity industry and in the industrial control industries. And SolarWinds is actually a really fascinating, and honestly, it's a really good product. I've used it to some extent in my career as well when I've worked with IT operations. And so it's a well-known product in IT operations, and really, I pulled this right off their website. By the way, I thought they were the best ones to speak about what they do. And so you can see they kind of do a lot of things, but really, it's really about performance, IT performance. So, are they, is your IT infrastructure doing what it should? Are there problems? Are there sorts of performance issues in databases or infrastructure, storage, bandwidth. And then they also do a really, this is actually kind of where it really gets sensitive, is they do a lot of configuration and change management. And so they can monitor environments for things happening in your IT systems and managing whether those changes were legitimate or illegitimate, or whether they were planned or not planned. And so they can give IT people some sense of what is here the infrastructure and asset visibility that they need, and also understanding what's changing and what's happening. And so it's a real fundamental product in information technology. And then they also have a security event manager inside their product as well. And that does a lot of normalization of log management and so forth. It actually, like a lot of people, SolarWinds, not to downplay what SolarWinds does, but a lot of people use SolarWinds to feed other SIEM and SIEM products. And so a lot of times SolarWinds is just an input into a larger cybersecurity operation. Next. So what happened to SolarWinds? Well, not everything, first of all, is publicly known or understood right now. But what we do know is that there was a compromise of their organization. And through that compromise, some adversary was able to add malicious code to the SolarWinds Orion codebase. This code that they added was actually fairly simple. Right now, we have probably an order of about 4,000 lines of code total here. There's a little bit more depending on what you call in and out of scope of what was part of SolarWinds versus what they pulled in from outside. But but it's a fairly small number of code changes compared to a very large code base, of course. And interestingly, we've moved heavily to code signing, of course, over the last decade plus. And so a lot of systems, including ICS, uses code signing to help prevent potentially malicious third-party applications from running in their environment as they should. Code signing is an amazingly effective tool to use in any computing environment. And so, but unfortunately, if you have access to the code base and the changes are made to the code base, then when the company then builds the product, builds the code, it then that malicious code gets incorporated into the code base, which gets signed as a whole. And so here, code signing is not a solution to the cybersecurity problem of running malicious third-party code, because most organizations at this point will have default, or they had to have default trusted SolarWinds signed binaries and code to run in their environment. We've seen similar attacks like this, though, where code signing certificates were stolen from companies like SolarWinds and from other code signing organizations. And then and then what they do is they then sign their malicious code to make it look like it came from a legitimate company and sent it out. So code signing has its problems, but it is by far a net good for the industry. So but I just want to highlight that this type of attack is not necessarily novel. It has been done. It's going to continue to be done. So code signing, again, is just one element of a risk mitigation strategy that organizations need to follow. Next. So, okay, so now that we know that a compromise occurred at SolarWinds and they injected malicious code into the code base, which was then signed, what happened then? Well, we know that about 18,000 SolarWinds customers, that's our current number. I don't know if that's going to change. I'm going to assume it's not, but we don't know yet, is that about 18,000 customers then ran this compromised version of Orion. What we do know is that that current knowledge and current evidence suggests that the first customer compromises went live sometime in early 2020. Sometime between January, February, or March, and there is some, and that's the best we have. Of those, there were some so basically some of those compromises were then followed on by an operation by some unknown adversary. So they used that access to then further compromise the environment. Microsoft has come out with a really fascinating set of blogs on credential attacks that were conducted utilizing forged SAML certificates to basically bypass multi-factor authentication and Kerberos authentication. And so that would lead to then long-term access to the environment. That's a really big problem, because what you have now is you basically have, at this point, you can see the current estimates, you have hundreds of environments that are compromised for an unknown length of time at this point, for at least a year. But if a company, of course, doesn't understand that they were compromised, or they don't have the data to do it, or to they don't have the data to understand it, then of course the issue is that they won't be able to figure out how long or how bad the adversary has compromised their environment. So they need to be able to track all of the compromised credentials down through the different credential chains. We know that we know that currently public numbers as to how many were fully compromised and operated on by the adversary is currently undercounted. And we know this because we have knowledge, and a lot of our cybersecurity partners in the industry also have knowledge of many organizations which had further malicious operations occur that basically are not publicly known. And so because of that, we know that the numbers are still low. We don't know how many are going to come into play here. Nobody's got perfect visibility, but we do know that the best estimate is we're talking about hundreds of organizations, again, that saw this follow-on activity. Additionally, yesterday, Microsoft came out with a blog post that said that there was additional compromise using SolarWinds, and this was through what we call a DLL sideloading attack. So this was not a compromise of SolarWinds code base. What this was is that the malicious adversaries were able to basically copy malware into a specific part of the operating system that SolarWinds automatically knew to load and execute. And then it would obviously be part of the signed code base at that point. So the problem with that is you have a trusted supply chain software that running untrusted code on its behalf, and so the operating system wouldn't be able to prevent that. Not in all cases. There are certain things you can do to turn that feature on, but in most cases, most people don't have that on. And so the problem with that then is, of course, we have probably a second adversary utilizing SolarWinds. Next. I'm going to bring all of those threads together for you in the next slide, but I wanted to highlight something important before we go on to talk about what the threat means. And to talk about what this threat means, I need to clarify that we have two types of, in industrial control systems, we have two types of malicious operations. We have access operations, which are gain access to something. And then we have effects operations, which are to do something with that access. And in offensive and malicious ICS attacks, we see sometimes those two things being very, very distinct. We have what we would see as an access operations team, and then we would have either one or multiple effects operations teams that would come in after the fact. Several of our threat groups at Dragos do this, and we've highlighted it in our intelligence. And so it's important to recognize that from an ICS threat perspective, we view the world a little differently than IT does. The majority of IT people right now are out there talking about espionage as a critical component, as the major component of this campaign. At Dragos, and generally in the ICS community, we don't make that early statement for a reason, which is that the long-term and large-scale supply chain access is something we've seen in ICS before. And what's important to realize is we've seen it for both espionage and we've seen it for disruptive and destructive effects. And so the fact is that just because you have access operations doesn't mean that it is espionage that follows. And the fact is that we have a lot more data on what this means in a holistic perspective. So next. So my last slide kind of rolls up here. What does this mean? Well, first of all, we know that many industrial ICS environments have been compromised by this code. And this includes electric, oil and gas, water, mining, manufacturing, and others. We also know that SolarWinds is a critical component of IT operations. And in fact, it's probably best to describe it as almost like a Microsoft in IT, in that the scope and depth of their access and the ability that the SolarWinds products have, and honestly, many other products like SolarWinds have to monitor and manage an environment is very, very large. And in most cases, whatever SolarWinds does is trusted by default by the organization, because the organization is using SolarWinds basically as a proxy for their own IT operations. And so we have to understand that this is effectively a fully trusted piece of software running inside these environments with really deep and complete access to what they can do. In the industrial control sector, we utilize SolarWinds. And that is because it is actually a really good piece of software and a good service that the majority of the world's large enterprises need support for. But the fact is that this is a major ICS risk because of the risk we face. Because we have long-term deep access into industrial environments, and because these industrial environments include things like critical infrastructure, volatile chemicals, life and safety operations, and so forth, we cannot necessarily be okay with saying this is an espionage campaign. That is not okay in ICS. Why? Because we have to look much broader at the risk. It's not, we're not running just computers here where people can take data off of. We're running industrial processes on which people rely both to live, but also to rely for safe operation so that the asset owners and operators, of course, won't die in a major industrial incident. And so we don't have the luxury of necessarily boxing the risk down with such a massive compromise like we've seen here. And so right now, we have to kind of assume, not the worst case, but we have to at least expand our risk profile to say that there are other things that could potentially happen. And now some people might say, well, why, Sergio, would you say something like that? That seems a bit crazy, but it's not. And let me tell you. So first of all, SolarWinds is not unique. There are hundreds of companies in the world that do this. So if you're looking for SolarWinds in your environment, that's great. Number one thing you should be doing, and Ben's going to go into that. Number two thing you should be doing, though, is after you get past SolarWinds, is to start looking for other services and products which provide a similar function to your organization, and start exposing maybe your risk calculus to those software and services as well. One particular threat actor and our activity group that we track is Zenitime. Zenitime was responsible for the major safety compromise in oil and gas. And so we call them the most dangerous cyber threat in the world. Years ago and continuing now, we've seen Zenitime continue to exploit and compromise industrial control vendors and OEMs, likely to have supply chain access for very similar attacks. And again, here you have an adversary which has demonstrated counter safety operations, right? Their job was to remove the safety features from the plants in order to cause, detrimental impact to life and safety around inside the plant and around it. Additionally, just a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we saw the MEDOC compromise, which is a piece of accounting software that's utilized in Ukraine. And through that software supply chain compromise, we saw the delivery of NotPetya, which was a wiper. People call it ransomware, although the ransom part was completely removed from the code. There was no ransom about it. It was just a destructive wiper that was then sent out through this medium. And so here you see, what I see then from a threat intelligence perspective is I'm seeing a risk to industrial control operators. And I also see a growing threat inside the software supply chain that is being utilized for large scale and deep access into organizations that can be used to deliver and has been used to deliver destructive effects prior. So overall, that's what we're seeing. And so that we're speaking from the industrial control perspective, and so we have to be very careful about recognizing how engineering and the specific functions of industrial control get applied, and why exposure to an adversary like this at this scale is such a big deal to the environment. So I just want to take one question really quick, and then I'll pass it over to Ben, which is that to get malicious code into a code base and to have it authorized, it does not require an insider threat. Anyone who has built large-scale industrial software before knows that when you're talking about millions and tens of millions of lines of code, that a lot of stuff gets missed in the process. So while code reviews should happen, a lot of code reviewers actually just click the yes bucket when they get the notification for code review. In addition to that, this malicious software that was injected into the code base actually had checks that it wouldn't operate inside of QA and test environments to prevent the QA and test teams from finding it. So there were a lot of really, really smart things. And one thing I want to note is that software compromise to do something like this is rare. It's really big when it happens, but it's rare. And the reason it's rare is for exactly the reason that was just pointed out in the question, in that a lot of times such compromises get caught way early in the development process by either the coder whose maybe account is being utilized to add the code, by the QA team or test teams and things like that. This adversary absolutely knew and had experience compromising supply chains. And the reason we know that is because of how well that they engineered their code to prevent identification through these types of processes, which have caught adversaries compromising software supply chain before. So the reason people don't do it is because it's expensive and really hard. This adversary clearly had failed before and seen the tricks that many of us who have been involved in software supply chain before have seen. And so they've learned from their mistakes, which obviously poses a greater risk to the future because now we have an adversary who's able to do this at scale and knows how to do it. So with that, let me pass it over to Ben.
Awesome, thanks, Sergio. With that threat perspective, we're going to switch gears and really just focus on what we're talking to our customers about, what our recommendations are to our customers, why we're recommending that, and largely extending that out to the community as well on what we recommend the community do. And Kai will take my high level and go a little bit deeper on how you can perform some of this assessment and hunting internally on your teams. First and foremost, our recommendation is assume compromise. While Dragos is aware of multiple compromised SolarWinds installations within an industrial environments, right now we're not currently aware of any known what we would call a breach, or I would say adversary access into this industrial environment. But at the same time, that is completely not surprising because a large number of our customers that we're talking to, they don't have the ability from a visibility or logging perspective to say convincingly one way or another if they have had an adversary access. So largely we're dealing with several unknowns here that put us in a very kind of uncomfortable state. So what we don't know the extent of the supply chain compromises, as Sergio illustrated. We're finding out new information nearly daily at this point, and I believe we will continue to better understand the ramifications of all this in the order of months, not days or weeks. And we don't know what was accessed in these environments and what tools and tactics were used by the adversary. We learned yesterday of a new web shell that was exposed. I believe that was by Microsoft's reporting called Supernova. And we expect more and more information along that lines to continue to iterate. What we do know, what we would expect to see if the adversary will understand what environments they are in, and they will have ICS flavored focus that's going to be either research, recon, or other aspects of maintaining persistence within that environment. What we are recommending to our customers: one, if you have visibility, focus on the critical sites. You will be able to identify SolarWinds within your environments. And once you identify those SolarWinds installations, you can identify if they were the compromised versions of the SolarWinds installations. Certainly, if you are finding compromised SolarWinds, you need to do a deep dive hunting on understanding if there were exfiltration, lateral movement attempts, relying on not just your network data, but also confirmation with your host data. That is in a good spot. Unfortunately, that is not the majority of our customers to date. The majority of our customers just simply lack the visibility in order to do this assessment. So this is where you have to assume compromise across all of these environments. And while you may be able to identify the SolarWinds versions, if you find a compromised SolarWinds version, because of your lack of visibility, your lack of logging, you won't truly be able to identify if the adversary had access into your environment, which is where, again, you need to focus on assessing and hunting on what data you do have, but also largely recognize that because of your collection management structure as it exists or your lack of visibility, you do need to focus on what is going on presently, because you won't have logs from 90 days ago or 180 days. So you need to focus on the present, and you need to focus on the future state and gain the visibility. Particularly, we encourage you from all of our assessments and hunting, focus not on border traffic, but on east-west traffic within the perimeters of your level 3, level 2 networks in order to tease out what is happening in your environments. Now, to walk through a well-architected SolarWinds instance. So we had a customer where they acknowledged SolarWinds was in their DMZ environment. And on the outside looking in, this looks like it's in a good state. This looks like they're in the DMZ, they're not trusted, but keep in mind the overview that Sergio gave at the very beginning. SolarWinds does not exist in this environment to monitor other equipment in the DMZ. I mean, it may, but that's not why it was designed. That's not why it's there. It's there to monitor the rest of the control system environment down to level 3, down to level 2, which means if the adversary has access into that host and that host has actively monitoring these devices that are potentially your crown jewels within your environment, you're at risk from that adversary perspective. The adversary does have access. What we found oftentimes in industrial environments, the name of the game is access. If the adversary is gaining access in the environment, then you're in a position of weak defense where the adversary has a lot of opportunity and the defender doesn't. So the focus isn't on, well, the SolarWinds is firewalled off and we're good to go. In this case, it's actually not firewalled off. But even if there were a firewall between the DMZ applications and in the supervisory network as shown here, there's still communications that we would expect to see between SolarWinds, direct or indirect, and maybe very tightly scoped, or maybe very broad where it's host-host, any sort of traffic is allowed. So this is an area to explore for sure. The second area that we really try to hone in on in the blog post that was posted yesterday is the third-party environments, the maintenance and diagnostics of vendor support networks, and what does that look like? I pulled an example of a classic GE architecture, not because I'm particularly worried about GE or their maintenance and diagnostics networks, but because they have been very transparent. There's a lot of material online. So I was able to grab this from the internet, illustrating what it means to be a third party in maintenance and diagnostic a maintenance and diagnostic sort of environment. What you see here is after the managed router that is on the right-hand side, everything else is on the asset owner's premise. But the monitoring network that you detail here, that's largely, in this case, owned and maintained by GE, which means you do not understand necessarily what is going on within that environment. And in this case, it's well architected with a electronic security perimeter, which is a bit of jargon from NERC SIP. So this looks like it's NERC SIP related, but there's a firewall here. There's a lot of questions on still what's the level of access between all these systems and where are the trust levels. In the Dragos platform in particular, we've been monitoring some of the perimeters of these environments and the crosstalk east and west traffic, and we've seen weird things. We've seen vendors use PowerShell scripts to do port enumeration of assets within the customer's environment. In that case, it was a turbine control environment. We've seen other scanning and enumeration. We've seen work outside of maintenance windows that was not authorized to be performed. The key takeaway, not just with SolarWinds, but with third-party networks, is trust them. You are working with this vendor for a reason. They are providing value back to them. So you do want to trust them. It's not about removing them from your network. That ship has already sailed. It's about putting in the controls, the visibility, and the verification steps to understand what the interactions are between that third party and your network. Oftentimes, very critical networks, which is why there are these connections in from a support and maintenance perspective. With that, we urge you to gain visibility in your environment, and when you're not having that visibility and you need to piece together a plan, Kai is going to walk through some of the considerations that we take in effect as we've been working with customers over the last couple of weeks, and we'll continue on. So with that, I'll kick it over to you, Kai.
Thank you, Ben. And just to reiterate quickly what Sergio and Ben already pointed out, from an adversary point of view, selecting a tool like SolarWinds to intrude into your environment is brilliant. I mean, no mistakes made here. I mean, these guys are, I don't like them. I'm a defender. But from what they do strategically and tactically, how they select the weakest points in our environments is actually some quite good thinking, because even more so than security tools or even your Active Directory, the monitoring tools are probably trusted all over your environment. So IT, OT, other parts of the connected networks, basically everywhere, including what we just pointed out, connected or even MSSP managed networks. And that simply does not happen with most other types of tools. And even with Active Directory, you have different domains probably for your IT and OT environment. In many cases, though, not so much with the monitoring, because you want to centralize that somewhere. At least that's what I've seen in spending some 14 years in the steel industry. So yeah, what you should be doing to get now the visibility about is your security tool or your monitoring tool behaving, focus on the internal traffic, especially though DNS, firewall, and proxy logs. And next slide, please. This is just a quick example of what you could look for in a DNS query. Big shout out here to the colleagues at Microsoft that have done a tremendous job in putting out articles over the past few days. Like one day, each day shows a new article where you go into the details. And also there was a question in Q&A, like the Supernova and how to detect that. I might go into this for like a minute at the end, but read those blogs. They have all the details in there. Currently the best stuff for how to actually go about detection. But what you want to aim for in DNS log detection. So this is stage 1 command and control lookup. So there are a couple of constants within that DNS name, which is, for example, the AppSync API is constant, and also the top level domain, avsvmcloud.com. So second and first TLD. There are a few things that are interchangeable. So you see that with EU West 1, US West 2, and so on. And the host name portion is, which looks like random gibberish, is actually derived from the individual host that this malware is running on. So it contains information already encoded in the host name that gives some pointers to the adversary of where this is running and what type of machine this is running on. And that's as much as is currently known. But at the end of the day, if you read that domain name right, left, you can quickly, with some grabbing through your DNS logs, or if you run this in a centralized log aggregator like Splunk or Elastic, create some detection rules on what you should start looking into, and if you potentially have any communication attempts to command and control domains in your environment. So one of the steps to help you find compromised SolarWinds Orion servers in your environment. Next slide, please. So if you do not have network visibility, and as Ben mentioned, quite a few of us do not have that, especially not in our OT environments. So now these are the logs you should start collecting. And also if you determine there might be compromised systems in your environment, regardless of whether that is already only SolarWinds Orion server or already some systems that you see in strange communication between the network management software and those systems, this is what you need collecting. Actually, it helps to approach this more systematically with what we call collection management framework. So basically list out all the systems in your environment, what type of logs they're creating, how long these logs are kept in your environment and where they're stored. We'll get to that in a bit, have a link for you. But yeah, you should of course focus on the usual security logs in your environment. Big caveat here, I know in OT environments, most of us do not run AV for good reasons. But also, if you go to the SolarWinds Orion support pages on their web server, they actually have a mandatory AV exclusion in their support documentation. So SolarWinds itself, all the directories should be excluded from AV detection. So even though currently, as far as I know, all antivirus software does contain detections for compromised SolarWinds installations, you won't be able to find it if you're following installation guidelines from SolarWinds. So you need to run a distinct search with AV. Of course, you should be collecting all relevant Windows and PowerShell usage logs. Especially, I recommend focusing on user logons, logoffs, and PowerShell usage. So one of the few TTPs currently known from the adversary is they love leveraging PowerShell like almost everybody else. So if you see unusual PowerShell command line activity going from the SolarWinds server to any other system in your environment, that should be investigated. But remember what Ben just said a few minutes ago, we have seen benign usage of some crazy PowerShell scripts in customer environments. So it doesn't necessarily mean this is bad. It needs investigation. If you have a compromised SolarWinds Orion system, of course, you need to focus on collecting forensic data. So the number one thing to note here is do not switch the system off immediately, because if you lose the memory content, there goes valuable information necessary for doing good incident response. So the number one thing you should be doing with those systems is create a memory dump, then disconnect it, and create a full disk image afterwards. Also, if you determine the system is compromised, all systems that could be connected to this, which again, the bad news might be all your systems, at least on the server side, or systems with distinct functions in OT environments like HMIs, engineering workstations, data historians, at least run a memory dump on all those Windows hosts and collect all event logs, registry hives, and the master file table. So you can start some scoping from an incident response perspective on determining if these systems were tampered with. Next slide, please. So how do we quickly analyze if we have or might be dealing with a compromised environment? Number one, you should get the very effective and well-written FireEye Yara rules from the link posted here. For our customers, we created a wrapper for those Yara rules. So you basically just run a script and it comes in a package. So you just need to type one single command into a Windows shell and you're done with it. But mostly everyone can recreate that, but highly recommend you use those rules. I haven't seen any false positives with these. They're very effective at detecting the compromised DLL. They do not detect the other one though, I'll talk about in a bit. Again, once you identify any potentially malicious system, collect the memory and then do memory analysis to find any processes that shouldn't be there or that don't pass the sniff test on being benign. Also list all accounts registered on the system. This is especially important for not local accounts. So any domain account that was connected to a SolarWinds Orion server that you deem compromised is burnt. So you should list those out. and also identify all other systems these accounts were used on, because that might also show you some hints that there might be an adversary using just your benign accounts, and especially service accounts, like the one Orion's running under, to connect to various systems. Because once they have the credentials to that account, they can easily pivot through your environment. And yeah, identify any unusual connections from Orion servers to other systems. And again, especially focus on command line and PowerShell, because that is usually what the adversary might be leveraging for initially landing and expanding in your environment. Next slide, please. So this is how you hunt for compromised hosts. Again, depending on whether you have monitoring capability or not. So in this workflow, I'm assuming you don't have a central monitoring capability. What we need is a memory dump, and at a minimum, if we don't have the time for full disk image, the Windows event logs and the registry hives, and then we analyze this for unusual connections to other systems, connections from the SolarWinds servers in our environment, and again, the accounts that were used with those connections, because these accounts can be used effectively in tracing what else the adversary might have pivoted onto. Yeah, focus on unknown or suspicious processes in memory, and again, unusual usage of command line and PowerShell commands. Will this be easy to run through if you don't have a lot of incident response experience? Absolutely not. This takes a lot of work and a lot of experience, and again, a lot of knowing your environment and what is good usage and what is not, because in any larger environment, there will be some crazy PowerShell scripts, for example, going on without you possibly being aware of it if you haven't monitored for this in the past. So this is a good way to quickly learn all the nuts and bolts of your environment. Next slide, please. Big caveat here. Again, if you have not done DFIR, so digital forensics and incident response before, you should get some help because again, without knowing too much about the techniques, tactics, and procedures used by the adversary at this stage in time, it is incredibly difficult of hunting for any type of breach in an environment, especially if you don't have a lot of network visibility. Focus on collecting the right data and then get help. So your immediate task should be, if you assume you have some level of compromise in your environment, start collecting the data. So first collect the data, then isolate the systems, not the other way around. And yeah, this is also a good reminder for, we should at least in all organizations have a basic capability of how to do the first steps of incident response. So again, collecting the data and knowing when and how to isolate systems so we can preserve important data necessary for conducting analysis and response. Next, please. So this is real quick, just fly over. This is mostly for housekeeping, so you have it in the deck once you can download it. A tool you can use that is rather easy to use for collections. So next, please. And same, a walkthrough for how to collect data off a virtual system. So what I really recommend is if you have virtualization, great. Cloud, not so great. Virtualization, awesome in OT environments because you don't have to interrupt the operations of a system for a long time. You just pause the machine and just copy some files over and start the virtual machine again. You don't even have to shut it down to get at forensic data. So that is a plus for virtualization in OT environments. Next, please. So kick it over back to you, Ben, because we're talking about NERC implications, right?
Yes, so absolutely, we did want to include a section on what is really relevant here from a NERC SIP asset owner perspective, recognizing not everyone on this call is a North American electric asset owner, but we did want to touch on that in regards to really three SIP standards. So SIP 13 certainly is in play from a supply chain perspective. Really, the key takeaway is that each utility should be asking their vendors if they're using SolarWinds Orion and get guidance on what versions of the vendor has used from that aspect. Additionally, from a SIP5 perspective, so we fully expect conversations to be focused on SolarWinds compromise and Orion in future audits. So understanding the timelines associated with SolarWinds in particular, all of the hot fixes and patches and mitigation plans associated with that, we highly encourage all the asset owners and the compliance programs to keep in mind how you'll be answering these questions in future audits. And then finally, from a SIP 008 perspective, certainly we have new guidance, new rules coming in effect with version 6 in January. That could potentially change the terms and what is potentially required from an incident response requirements perspective of adding in that attempt to compromise and what does that mean in this language from a lot of what we're covering. Compromise software such as SolarWinds could easily fall into scope here, and we encourage you to have discussions on what that looks like and what the interactions between NERC, DHS, CISA, and some of the other agencies that are involved there. So we did want to highlight that and not just leave it off in a vacuum and not discuss it. But with that, that is our presentation for today. We did reference a lot about visibility and focusing on understanding how far back your logs are going, what logs you do have, and if you can answer the question of if these environments have been accessed by the adversary. 2 years ago, almost to the day, a little over 2 years ago, we released a white paper that is still available on the Dragos website called Collection Management Frameworks. It is in the resources section of Dragos. It walks you through the structure and methodology of how Kai's team does capture the visibility in the environment and link that towards the security operations centers and other activities, so that you know ahead of time if you can or can't answer the question, or how far back in time can you go to answer questions such as what's presented today, which is largely, if I have a compromised instance of SolarWinds, was it accessed by the adversary? The collection management framework can help you with that, can put in place a regime of understanding where to start your hunting, where to do your assessments, and where to make improvements so that you can do more robust hunting and build stronger incident response plans and be able to action them in meaningful ways. With that, Sergio, I know you are looking at some of the Q&A going on in our chat. We have about 10 minutes. I'm not sure if you've been keeping track of any questions that you may want to raise while we have the time here to help provide some guidance.
Sure, absolutely. So let's go through some of these. I've answered about 33 questions so far. I've been trying to type as fast as I can here. A lot of really good questions from everybody, so I appreciate it. I think we could do a follow-on blog post capturing some of these questions and answering some of them for you, in a written format. So some of the more important ones, or some of the ones we're not able to answer, I think we'll probably try to follow on with you to make sure you get an answer. So, okay, question is, if only 18,000 of the 300,000 customers ran the code, is it a reflection on patch cadence for this type of system, or is the ratio simply due to that most of the 300,000 customers were not using the compromised product? It's actually a mixture of both. And so how we get down to 18,000 of the 300,000 customers of SolarWinds is exactly both. Some of them weren't using the parts of the software that were compromised, and then some of it was that the patch cadence for a product like SolarWinds is very, very slow, because again, it is a very, very risky product when it comes to, if it had an outage, it could potentially have implications into IT downtime and so forth. So it is a little bit of both of those. Okay, so let's see.
Yeah, while you're looking for our next one, Kai, Serge, I'll hit up Kai on another one. We can kind of go back and forth.
Please, that sounds great.
One of them, which just scrolled past, was if patching and hotfixes have been applied to a SolarWinds box, is it too late to do forensics? Certainly, I have my answer, Kai, but what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's never too late, but again, it's the usual way to do things is collect forensic evidence first and then start patching. What we usually see is what we call the panic cycle, and I've been there hundreds of times in my career over the past 20 years. So admin detects a compromise on the system, so they reboot it like 5 times and install all the patches they weren't installing over the past 12 months. So please do not do that. So what you should be doing, if regardless whether it's SolarWinds or any other incident, if you are suspicious that some system might have been tampered with, the number one thing you do is, if it's a server, call your security team. Don't disconnect it, don't reboot it, nothing. Call them if you have an internal security team. If you don't, follow the slides I have in there for download later on, how to collect data, and then disconnect it from the network, but leave it running. Leave the system running. Even better if it's a system that has some end user abilities, just let it go to sleep. So disconnect it from power and it just starts sleeping. And all the memory is in hyperfill.sys, so easy to collect. But to go back to the question, if you've already patched, yeah, we'll see that in forensics. It might have overwritten something, but you should still do the collection and preparation for forensics.
Yeah, and I would just add, largely we're looking for post-exploitation activity. We may not be able to, the longer that time elapses, the harder it is for us to answer questions. But what we would be focused on from that forensics perspective is post-exploitation activity.
Absolutely. And maybe just real quick to interject on the question on Supernova. So how to detect that? The simplest way currently, because as far as I'm aware, there's no YAR rule for it yet, but the simplest way to detect it is the original Supernova DLL, so the benign one from SolarWinds, is actually signed with a valid certificate. The one that Microsoft found is not. So if you follow that Microsoft article, find that DLL in the inet pub subdirectory, so it's part of the web server. If it is not signed with a valid certificate, there is a high likelihood it's malicious. That's as easy as it can get.
Yeah, and it gets back, Kai's exactly right. It gets back to the best practice that you should only allow signed code on your systems for the most part, wherever possible, basically. If it's possible to limit your, limit the installation, the download, the execution of signed code, if you can, then it should absolutely be a limitation that is applied. So Ben and Kai, a question that's kind of popped up in a lot of different ways here is, okay, I've got SolarWinds, what now? Should I shut it down? Should I isolate it? You should make sure it's not connected to the internet. What should the immediate, assuming somebody's found they have SolarWinds today, what should they do in their ICS? What should they do about it immediately?
I would say understanding if it's the compromised version, which there are many places where you can find that information. Dragos website, also FireEye, Microsoft, CISA, that information is available. But you also need to go back in time to at least the end of 2019 to see if there were release cycles where you were previously compromised and maybe you didn't upgrade after that to the untampered version. So it is reviewing the last year's worth of either change management or logging that's on the system to understand if you are ever exposed there. And then if you are exposed from a compromised perspective, that's when we need to start digging in a bit more to understand the activity around that. Would you add anything there, Kai, or does that?
Yeah, maybe for once put on the risk hat, which I usually never ever do. But I mean, deciding on shutting off a system should never just be an IT or operations decision, because as we mentioned previously, SolarWinds might be really important for your visibility in your environment. So loss of visibility might lead to escalating problems down the road. So it needs to be a business decision whether you can easily shut down the whole SolarWinds system. You can maintain a cleaned up version of that system and still go hunting for any potential compromise. And usually my recommendation, and I know there's a lot of incident responders out there doing IT incident response that would object to that, but with the OT perspective of maintaining safety and reliability of operations at all times, I would recommend ensure that the SolarWinds installation itself is no longer compromised and go hunting through your environment, but try to maintain the system because it fulfills an important business function in your environment.
I think we're getting to the time. I do want to add one thing. As Kai walked through, his network-based analysis was fairly straightforward. Like the lift on if you have the DNS, the NetFlow data is much more straightforward than if you have to go to each individual host. Like that doesn't really scale well. That's why we focus on east-west traffic. I know I say that it sounds biased. We produce technology that does exactly that, but that's also why we produce a technology that does exactly that. So we encourage assessing the network-based visibility, whether it's Dragos or roll your own solution at home. But that visibility is really critical in being able to quickly do this because also everyone's watching. There will be similar sort of attacks that I'm not predicting anything, certainly, but everyone learns from everyone else, both from defense and offense. And right now the defense is behind the curve. It's a lot harder to defend these environments than it is to attack them. And largely that is due to visibility. So I will, in the note on that, I have had great conversations with customers over the last couple of weeks. We see everyone focus on this, taking it seriously, moving a lot of personal life around with the end of the year in order to adjust to this. Defense is totally doable. That's something that we need to focus on and understand. Not all is lost. We're in a good spot. But we do need to drill into this and understand exactly the implications of all of this activity. So thank you for your time today. Have a good New Year's and talk to you soon.